Our second lesson this morning comes from John's Gospel, the 11th chapter, beginning in verse 32 and reading through verse 44. When Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she knelt at his feet and said to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. He said, "Where have you laid him?" And they said to him, "Lord, come and see." Jesus began to weep. So the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man kept this man from dying?" Then Jesus, again greatly disturbed, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone was lying against it. Jesus said, "Take away the stone." Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, "Lord, already there is a stench, because he's been dead 4 days." Jesus said to her, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. And Jesus looked upward and said, "Father, I thank you for having heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I have said this for the sake of the crowd standing here, so that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said this, he cried with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out!" The dead man came out, his hands and feet bound with strips of cloth, and his face wrapped in a cloth. Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go." This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
So Lazarus has been dead for 4 days before Jesus showed up at the grave. The condensed version of what happens next is this: Jesus orders the stone to be removed from the mouth of the tomb, and then he says, "Lazarus, come out." And lo and behold, Lazarus, dead and stinking for 4 whole days, responding to the voice of Jesus Christ, walked out of the tomb alive. I lost my father on February the 7th, 2011, and it still doesn't really seem real. When my sister and my mother were finally ready to leave the hospital room after Dad had died, we made it out of the room and around the corner, and we're standing at the elevators, and all of a sudden my mother realized that she had left her glasses in the room where Dad was. And she asked me to go back to get the glasses because she could not bear to walk back into that room where the body of her husband lay in the hospital bed. So I said, "Okay, I'll do that." And I went back to the room, and once I got there, I realized the door had shut. So I knocked on the door. Not thinking, I knocked on the door. You see, I'd been conditioned my entire life to knock on the door if my father was in the room on the other side. It's impolite just to barge in on someone's son, so I knocked. Probably an honest mistake, or maybe I was still being obedient. I don't know. What I do know, however, about that little story I just told you is that if I had knocked on that door and my dad answered it, I believe I myself would have died. Because people don't come back from the dead, do they? Stories of people coming back from the dead generally capture our attention. It's intriguing stuff. But the account of Lazarus in the 11th chapter of John being brought back from the dead is hardly the only interesting thing that goes on in that chapter. There's a whole lot more. Here's just a few examples. Lazarus was the brother of Mary and Martha. This was a family that Jesus deeply loved. And Jesus had known that Lazarus was sick. They'd sent word to him. But he had intentionally waited before he came into town to see the family. And in the meantime, while he was intentionally staying away, Lazarus died. The last time Jesus had been in that area, crowds had tried to surround him and kill him. But he's heading back there anyway. because he's on his way to Jerusalem, you see, where he would be arrested. He would be put on trial, tortured, killed, and buried, after which he himself would walk out of a tomb. The chapter is full of things. But for our purposes this morning, I would like for us to just focus on two things. And those two things are the words of Jesus. The words of Jesus that instill in us hope. And secondly, what Lazarus did when he heard Jesus speak, which should inspire our own actions. Today is All Saints' Day. It is a time for the church to turn its attention to the deceased saints of the past, the men and women whose lives bore witness to a hope rooted in the gospel that proclaims God's victory over death. Our fathers, our mothers, our husbands, our wives, our brothers, our sisters, and friends who have passed away, but while they were here with us, lived their lives as examples of Christ's love and mercy. Most of us here in this room today know what it feels like to lose a loved one, and we all react and respond differently. Sometimes we're just numb, and we succumb to a type of denial. Sometimes we're confused, and for the life of us, we can't understand why God would let this loved one die. Sometimes we're simply angry. And sometimes we're so racked with grief that our lives begin to systematically fall apart. And sometimes we just blame God, which is pretty much what Martha and Mary did after Lazarus died. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. This comes from Mary. Martha also has expressed the exact same sentiment in verse 21 of chapter 11. If you had just been here, Jesus, he'd be alive. Before Jesus responds to Mary, he weeps. He weeps with her and the other mourners that were gathered at the tomb. But then Jesus gets to work. Take me to where Lazarus is laid and remove that stone. Remove the stone from the tomb. Prior to arriving at the tomb, Jesus had pulled Martha aside, or actually Martha had pulled him aside, worried about her brother. And Jesus had told Martha, Martha, I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. And then a pause. And he looks at Martha and he says, do you believe this? How many times have you heard those comforting words read during funerals, memorial services? I am the resurrection and the life. And truthfully, how many times have you actually struggled with if you really believe that everyone who lives and believes in Jesus will never die? Do you believe that? Or are these just empty words intended to comfort you, but don't mean a whole heck of a lot the next day when you instinctively pick up the phone to call your loved one who has just died? Take away the stone, Jesus said. He was about to intercede on this family's behalf. He was about to demonstrate the power his life had over death. He was about to reveal to the entire crowd of mourners, who, by the way, also had questioned why Jesus had not prevented Lazarus' death. He was about to reveal to these people who his heavenly Father was. But before Jesus could do anything, Martha rushes up to Jesus and says, Lord, wait. There's already a stench on the body. He's been dead for 4 days.